Good afternoon. Welcome. Thanks for being here in person, and welcome to all those who have joined us online as well. So this is Raghavendra's PhD colloquium. My name is Vijay. So Raghavendra, there's a little bit about Raghavendra before he goes on to give his talk. Raghavendra has a bachelor's in computer science from MIT, and then he did his master's by research here in the Department of Computer Science and Automation, where he worked on some problems related to the detection of robust voids in biomolecules. He also designed fast algorithms at that time. So after that, he joined the PhD program, and in the PhD program, he has been looking at the study of topological structures and how to compare topological structures, motivated by problems from scientific visualization. And that's going to be the topic of his talk today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Vijay, for a generous introduction. Since I have been introduced, I will straightly go to the title of the talk, which is Comparative Analysis of Topological Structures. So, comparative analysis is fairly simple to understand. Everyone knows that comparison is a very fundamental operation when it comes to any kind of data processing, analysis, and so on. So, the other part is topological structures. Topological structures from the perspective of computer science is a kind of a data structure, and it captures connectivity information. So if we have a terrain, we can capture the peaks and valleys of this terrain by using a topological structure. Or if we have been standing in between two peaks, and if we want to decide which of the peak is easier to climb, that kind of information can also be captured by a topological structure. So topological structure comes in many flavors. So it can be a set of points as shown here. It can be a tree, which is a graph without a cycle. It can be a graph with cycles along with the domain and so on. So with all these flavors of topological structures, there is one common underlying theme, which is one, it captures the connectivity of the data set, and the other, it's a combinatorial data structure, and it's easy to store and manage in terms of memory and computation. And it is also invariant to rigid body transformations like scaling, rotation, and so on. So the structure can be rotated, scaled, it can even be squished, it can be elongated, and so on, as long as the connectivity remains the same. So if we, for example, delete an edge or remove a cycle, as in this case, then the topological structure will not remain the same. So now, why do we want to do this comparative analysis of topological structures? So because we want to compare something else, which are scalar fields, and we compare the scalar fields via this process of computing topological structures upon them. So scalar fields are real valued functions. So if we have a domain which is a surface or a volume, we can define a real valued function. In this case, for example, we have a electron density as a scalar field, which is from the cryo-EM measurements of a protein. So we can start by thinking about doing point-wise comparisons based on the values which are given here. But we quickly run into problems because the point-wise comparisons are very prone to noise, and it is not able to capture the higher level structures which the biologists want to capture from these kind of analysis. So instead of that, what we do is we build this topological structure, which gives us an abstract or a combinatorial description of the data. But the structure can be very noisy and it might not make sense anyway. So there is a process of simplification which allows us to remove this topological noise from a particular structure to get a simplified structure. So here we can see that a simplified structure is being embedded in this volume. And once the simplified structure is obtained, we can do a comparative analysis by comparing the structure with itself in this case to generate some symmetric structures as shown here. So by doing this whole process, what we are able to do is we can capture this symmetry which is present in the protein, and also we can capture it in multiple scales. For example, the first image shows the symmetry captured in a lower scale, and the second image shows the same symmetry captured in a higher scale. So this multiple scales can be captured by this topological comparison. So that is what we are worried about. So the first two steps of this pipeline have been well studied, the construction of the topological structure and also the simplification. So we are more worried about the last stage here, which is comparing the topological structures or the substructures in such a way that we can gain some insights about the data. So now there has been a variety of comparison measures which help in comparing such structures. We can see it in two ways. So one is how the structures itself can be classified. So the topological structures can be classified into three sets of structures. One is a set which is based on sets. So the topological structure contains just set of points as shown here. So the red and green points alone capture the topological structure. Then the structure is based on a graph where there are nodes and edges, and the connectivity is stored there, and that's how the graph-based structures work. And there are complex-based structures, which are a combination of the graph and also the underlying domain with some information about how the geometry of the domain is there. So as we can see, when we move from one structure to the other, the structure becomes complicated and also rich in information in some way. Depending on what level of information we want, we can compute a particular kind of structure and work on them. So as I said, lots of work has been done in comparing. So the first comparison measure which was defined was by Cohen, Steiner and others in 2007, which is called the bottleneck distance, which it compares two persistence diagrams. Further, there have been a lot of work in comparing persistence diagrams, and then there are works which compare other topological structures like merge trees, as I have listed in the graph-based structures. And in terms of the complex-based structures, we have only one work, which is by Narayanan and others, which gives the comparison between complete extremum graphs. We can also see this work in terms of a different lens, where we see whether the comparison measure is more oriented towards theoretical properties or how it works in practice. So in terms of theoretical properties, people always look for properties like whether the comparison measure is a metric, whether it's stable, whether it's discriminative enough, and so on. So many of the comparison measures which come under this topic have these properties, but the problem is that many of them are NP hard to compute. So while it offers a set of very good theoretical guarantees, it's very difficult to compute them and apply them in practice. And in some cases, it's even difficult to approximate. On the other hand, the practical measures are very simple to define. They also have polynomial time algorithms, and they are very easy to implement. But many of them lack theoretical guarantees, which would be very useful when deciding what kind of a measure can be used in what kind of a scenario. So to summarize, these are the gaps which we are able to come upon. So one is it's difficult to find comparison measures which have both theoretical guarantees and also have efficient algorithms and practically very feasible. The other part is all the measures which we have talked about till now, they are global measures, as in we have a topological structure, we have another topological structure, we can compare them, but we can't compare the substructures. In many cases, those substructure comparisons are also important, and that comes under this local comparison measures, and there are hardly any local comparison measures currently in the literature. And as we have already shown, there is a lack of comparison measures when it comes to complex-based structures. So these are some of the gaps which we are trying to address and fill to whatever extent possible. So to formally state our problem, what we want to do is we want to compare scalar fields, and we want to compare through this topological structures, and we want to design methods which aids in this kind of a comparison. In our work, we are considering two such topological structures. One is merge tree and one is extremum graph. And Ideally, a comparison measure should provide some theoretical guarantees. It should be efficient to compute. It should be easy to understand and interpret. And finally, it should be useful in practice in the sense that it should be able to handle reasonable size data and so on. So here are the contributions. So we divide our contributions into two sets, one which is applicable to merge trees and the other which is applicable to extremum graphs. So in case of merge trees, again, we have two sets of measures. One is a set of global measures and the other is a local measure. So we define two global measures. One is the ordered tree edit distance and the other is unordered or the merge tree edit distance. We also have a local measure to aid local comparisons, which is called as a local merge tree edit distance. We prove that the MTED and LMTED here are metrics. We provide some efficient algorithms to compute these metrics. And we also have a lot of applications in symmetry detection, periodicity detection, feature tracking, temporal summarization, and so on. Coming to the extremum graphs, we again define two comparison measures. One is called the positions distortion distance, and the other is the Gromov-Wasserstein distance. Again, there are some theoretical guarantees which says that these measures are metrics and so on. We also provide some applications to periodicity detection, temporal summarization, and similarity of pore networks in materials. And finally, we also define a time-varying data structure, which is called time-varying extremum graph. We have a very simple criteria to find correspondences between features in one time step to the next time step. And we also showcase some applications in feature tracking. So we'll move on to the main part, which is the comparison measures for the merge trees. The second part would be the comparison measures on the extremum graphs. So before going to the actual contribution, I want to cover some of the background material. Scalar field, as we have already discussed briefly, it's a real valued function which is defined on a particular domain. So in this case, the domain is the plane. And here the scalar function goes from low to high, from the color blue to the color red. So in the range, we can choose a particular value, which is called the ISO value. And we can see all the points in the domain which maps to this particular ISO value. So when we do that, we see these black curves, which are called the level sets of the function. So when we vary this ISO value from low to high, so the level sets are created, they grow, they merge, they split, and they get destroyed. So all these events, the creation, destruction, split, and merge, happen precisely at what are known as the critical points of the function. So the critical points of the function can be computed by seeing the local neighborhood of a particular point. So in the local neighborhood, if the function value of all the neighbors is higher than the vertex which we consider, then that vertex would be a minimum. If all the function values are lower, then it's a maximum. If there are function values which is both lower and higher, and depending on the number of components, it can be considered as a regular point or a saddle point. So once we have these critical points, which are minimum, maximum, and saddles, what we can do is we can use these critical points and build a data structure which is called as a merge tree. So what merge tree does is it captures the way the connectivity of these level sets change when we change the function value from this low to high or high to low. So let's consider the lowest function value. So when we pass that lowest function value, we encounter this minimum and a component is born. When we increase this function value a bit, the component grows, and meanwhile, we also find another minimum where another component is born. So these two components keep on growing, and at some point, they merge. So this merging happens at this saddle point, and now we have this order of these critical points the way they appear. So first, the minima in the right appeared, then the minimum towards the left appeared, and then the saddle. So we can use this order to define what is known as the topological persistence of a particular feature. So the minima here appeared later than the minima here, and the saddle appeared finally. So we have two components here which got merged in this saddle, and we can think of it as one component being created here and it is being destroyed here, the component which is being created here persists on further. So we start with two components and one component gets destroyed. So this is the birth point and this is the death point of this particular component. So we can pair this birth and death events and we can compute what is known as a persistence diagram. So in this, the birth happens here and the death happens here. And the length of this edge is given by the difference between the function value at these two critical points. So the higher this difference, it means that that particular feature persists for a long time. And this also gives us a way to simplify topological structures by considering the low persistent features which are here, which is close to the diagonal as noise, and we can do away with that. One observation is that the merge tree here has higher amount of information than the topological persistence diagram. And from the merge tree, we can always compute the persistence diagram, but not vice versa. So in cases where the merge tree is available to us, it makes sense to compare the merge trees directly rather than computing a persistence diagram and applying known measures which compare the persistence diagram instead. Also, one more observation is that these topological structures are based on the level sets of the function. Then the background is about the tree edit distance, since we are adapting the tree edit distance to the merge trees. So the tree edit distance works as follows. So we have two trees. We go from one tree to the other via a set of edit operations. So the edit operations are the relabel, which labels a node from changes the label of a node. Insert and delete actually inserts a particular node or deletes a node from the tree. So for each of these edit operations, we can define a cost, which is given by this cost function, and we can go from one tree to the other via a sequence of these edit operations. And if you want to know the cost of going from one tree to the other, we can just add up all these costs and we get the cost of the change from one tree to the other. So what tree edit distance can be defined as is the minimization of such cost. So we consider all such sequences and we want to find the minimum sequence so that the cost incurred while going from one tree to the other is the minimum. So tree edit distances satisfy a lot of properties. One such property is the mapping is 1-to-1, and then it preserves ancestors. There are no cross connections like this. And the other part is tree edit distances are also NP hard to compute. So if we want to compute tree edit distances, we have to impose another constraint, which is called as the restricted mapping, where we restrict the mapping from disjoint subtrees to disjoint subtrees. And by doing this, it's tractable. And also for the merge tree, the extra constraint also makes sense. So with this background, we come to the first contribution, which is the ordered merge tree edit distance. So here, the assumption is that merge trees are trees with a particular ordering. They are rooted, and we define a simple cost model based on persistence and the function value difference. And we have some small applications. So one such application is detection of periodicity in time varying data. So here we have a 2D vortex street where there is a obstruction here, which is causing the flow to create vortices, and these vortices flow from left to right. So there are 1000 time steps in this data, and this data is known to exhibit some periodicity. So what we do is we take the first time step and we compare it with all the other 1000 time steps, so that the distances will give us an idea about the period. So if there is a periodicity, then there should be a low distance somewhere, because the structure would be very similar to the first structure. So we detect this periodicity in terms of two periods. One is the multiples of 75, and there is also a half period which is given by around 37, 38. So this is a particular application from the ordered merge tree edit distance. The disadvantage of this contribution is that the algorithm is very slow. It's in the order of n to the power of 5. And one more assumption which we have made is that there is an ordering in the merge trees, but as far as we know, there is no consistent or a meaningful ordering which can be imposed on merge trees. So to overcome these disadvantages, what we do is we consider unordered merge tree edit distance, and this is inspired by constraint tree edit distance by Zhang. So here we define a cost model. We prove that our comparison measures a metric. The runtime is reduced to order of n square, and we show a lot of applications. So since the cost model is quite crucial, let's see how the cost model is derived. So we have two scalar fields. We have the merge tree here, and we derive the persistence diagram of these two merge trees, which are shown here. So if we want to consider these two features named P and Q, and we want to apply some edit, we want to define a cost. So how do we define costs? So we combine these two persistence diagrams, and we define the cost as follows. So the insert and delete operations are kind of complementary. So the costs are defined in a similar fashion. So if there is a feature here which we want to delete, the cost would be the n infinity distance between the feature in the diagram and the diagonal. Similarly, the insert cost is also defined in an analogous way. The reliable cost is slightly more complicated. So if we have two features, one is reliable to the other, so we can define the cost as a minimum of these two quantities. So one is the L infinity distance in the diagram between these two features. And the other case is where we can delete a particular feature and insert the other feature. So in that case, we add up the insertion and deletion costs, which is given by the second equation. So the overall cost is calculated as the minimum of these two costs. So with this, we come to the algorithm to compute the tree edit distance. So it's a dynamic programming algorithm. So if we have a split tree, two split trees which look something like this, the algorithm starts with the leaf nodes, which are given by these red nodes, and it continues to the higher and higher subtrees till it comes to the root node, which is I. So dynamic programming happens by construction of a table, which is shown in this figure. So if you want to find the entry which corresponds to the subtrees rooted at I10 and J7, so here are the entries highlighted, which is required to compute the entry at this point. So what we want to see here is that the entry here, it compares the subtree I10 with an empty tree. The entry here compares the subtree J7 with an empty tree. And then these two entries here and here, they compare J7 with the subtrees I8 and I7. And similarly, it compares I10 with subtrees J6 and J5. And finally, there is a highlighted entry here, which corresponds to the comparison of forests given by J6, J5 and I8, I7. So with all these entries computed, we can use this to compute the actual entry which corresponds to J7, I10. So this continues in the same fashion, and we finally get the last entry here, which gives us the edit distance between the two trees. So the next contribution is the local measure. So why do we want a local measure? As I have already said that many of the measures which we already have seen are global, and sometimes they are not sufficient. For example, here we have two scalar fields, and we see that if we do a global comparison, they are not similar because there is the structure which is present in one field, but it is not present here. But on the other hand, if we see these other structures highlighted, these are actually similar to each other. So it means that locally there are similar regions in the field, but a global distance won't be able to capture it. Also, this kind of similarity is hierarchical. There are multiple levels of such similarity, and a global distance would again fail to capture such similarities. So what we want is to address such scenarios and provide comparative measures which are local. So if we want to adapt our global measure to produce a local measure, there are some challenges, and how we solve them is presented in this slide. So the first challenge is that some subtrees are not merge trees. So the merge tree edit distance assumes that all the trees which are compared are merge trees. But in this case, it's not so, because if we consider the subtree at I8, so it has this root node, it has two leaf nodes. So if we apply persistence computation, so this node will be paired with this node. but the node I5 wouldn't have any pair in the subtree. It would be paired to some other node which is outside this subtree. So this violates the assumption that all our comparison happens between merge trees. So what we do is we add a dummy node here to construct a merge tree out of the original tree, and the function value of this dummy node is defined as small difference from the root node here. So by this we make all comparisons happen with respect to merge trees. Then the other disadvantage here is that the persistence of a particular node does not change once it's computed, and in some cases it would be very high compared to the subtree which we are trying to compare. So because of this, it will give many misleading results. So what we do is we also truncate the persistence in such a way that for each subtree, a particular node's persistence will change. So when the subtree which is compared is I8, the persistence is this. If the subtree compared is I10, then there will be the persistence would be something which is related to I5 and I11 and so on. So every step the persistence is changed. So with these modifications, we also have to modify the dynamic programming algorithm. So instead of one table which we had, we have to construct two tables, and I'm just highlighting the entries which are required to calculate the distance between a pair of subtrees here. So all the entries which are silver stars here correspond to the global merge tree edit distance, and you can see that everything comes from a single table. But the local merge tree edit distance depends on entries from this table and also this table. So using a combination of entries from both these tables, we can compute the local tree edit distance for a particular pair of subtrees. So I'll deal with some of the applications which are based on these two comparison measures. So first is a global measure. So the global measure can be used to do a temporal summarization. So here is a 3D vortex tree data set. There is a cylinder here, and a flow starts from left and it moves towards the right, and it encounters this cylinder as an obstruction. Because of that, vortices are formed, and these vortices move in this kind of a zigzag fashion, creating what is known as the vortex shedding. So to analyze this phenomenon, what we do is we consider the magnitude of the flow as our scalar field. This has 102 time steps. We construct split trees for all the time steps. So we have 102 split trees, and we do an all pair comparison by using our merge tree edit distance. So with this, what we get is we get a distance matrix which captures the distances of all pairs, and we see that the distance matrix has some patterns which we can highlight. So based on these patterns, we go back to the data and see what is happening in those time steps. So in the first block, the flow is still starting, and there are hardly any vortices which have been formed here. So that's why we see that all the distances are very, very low and all are similar to each other. Then in the next stage, we see that vortices start forming. Then we see the phenomenon of vortex shedding. Because of that, we can see sub blocks here where it shows the vortex shedding happening. And finally, towards the end, the vortices become quite distorted, and we see that distances are all high due to that. So by doing this kind of an analysis, what we can do is, instead of considering all the 102 time steps, we can pick regions where activity is similar, and we can summarize the whole phenomenon by considering only those similar blocks. So from the local merge tree distance, we can do symmetry detection. So here the data is influenza virus, which has been measured using cryo-EM microscopy, and the data consists of the electron density. So what we do is we first construct the merge tree, and we compare the merge tree with itself, and we have some refinements. So after the refinements, we can pick submatrices here, and we see that we have chosen some representative submatrices. We can see that these submatrices actually corresponds to symmetric regions. So each of the submatrix actually captures a set of regions in the domain which are symmetric to each other. This kind of symmetry helps the biologists in understanding these viruses better and designing their pipelines and so on. So we do some comparison with existing measures. So one comparison is based on the measures which are bottleneck and Wasserstein distances. So we do the comparison by using the 2D vortex feed data, and we see that the periodicity is being detected in all the three distances, but our distance has higher values than both the bottleneck and the Wasserstein, which means that our distance is more discriminative compared to the bottleneck and Wasserstein distance. Then in terms of runtime, the runtime is somewhat comparable with the existing solutions. To give a rough idea, so we have 1000 trees here, which has around 55 nodes each, and we do an all pairs comparison, which amounts to 10 power 6 comparisons. And on 12 cores, we were able to do it in 25 minutes. So the main bottleneck here is the forest comparison, where a bipartite matching needs to be solved. Then we also have some qualitative comparisons by considering other symmetry detection methods which are already there in the literature. So the symmetry detection methods which are already there considers contour trees as feature descriptors, augmented extremum graphs as feature descriptors, and some geometric descriptors like Laplace-Beltrami operator. So in case of the contour tree descriptor, one disadvantage is that no geometry is being considered. In our case, we have a proxy for geometry by considering all the points in the domain which map to a particular subtree in the merge tree. And we also consider merge tree, which is slightly simpler than the contour tree. Then in terms of the augmented extremum graphs, while the symmetry detection happens very well, there is this step where we need to choose some seed points where the symmetric regions are grown. So this choice is crucial there. And in our case, there is no user intervention in terms of choosing a seed point and so on. In case of the Laplace-Beltrami operator, it's a geometric descriptor, as I have already told. And that also gives good results. Our results are somewhat comparable to all the results which we have here. In terms of running time, some of them runs better than our comparison measure, and some of them runs worse. So to conclude this section, we present methods to compare global and local trees. And in case of the global measure, which is MTED, and LMTED, which is the local measure, we provide some theoretical guarantees in terms of proving that it's a metric and so on. We provide some efficient algorithms to compute them, and we have a lot of applications in symmetry detection, feature tracking, and so on. Some impact which we can highlight is that after this comparison measure has come up, there have been a lot of other comparison measures which are somewhat similar or kind of extension or based on this tree distance. So we want to highlight three of them. One is this geometry-aware merge tree comparison. The other is the Wasserstein distance between merge trees, and the branch decomposition independent edit distance for merge trees. How are we on time? Okay. 15 minutes. Okay, I can. Yeah. So we'll move on to the other contribution, which is comparative measures for extremum graph. So some background again. So one crucial difference between the merge tree and the extremum graph can be highlighted first. So in the merge tree, we know that it's a tree. It captures the peaks and valleys and so on. But when it comes to geometric vicinity, merge tree fails in capturing some of it. So let's consider these two peaks. So in terms of the domain, we can see that they are quite close by, and we can travel from one to each other via this path. But in the merge tree, if we want to do the same thing, we want to go from here to here. We have to take this path, which has like 4 edges, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the merge tree, while it captures the topology, fails to capture the geometric vicinity in some way. To alleviate that, we move on to two other topological structures, which are Morse-Mail complexes and extremum graphs. So in case of Morse-Mail complex, the way the structure is built is in a different way, where the gradient of the function is considered instead of the level set. And in the Morse-Mail complex, we can see that these two are quite close by in the topological structure itself. Extremum graph is a substructure of Morse-Mel complex. One reason why we consider extremum graph rather than Morse-Mel complex is that Morse-Mel complex is, even though it's a complete description of the domain in terms of how the regions behave and the connectivity between all the critical points and so on. So one disadvantage is that there are lots of saddle-saddle connections in the Morse-Mel complex, and the complex becomes too complicated to store and handle. On the other hand, extremum graph considers only a set of extrema. Here, in this case, it's the maxima and the saddles, and it also captures some of the geometry, if not all, when compared to the Morse-Mel complex. So this is somewhat in between the merge tree and the Morse-Mel complex. So this is often considered when we want to capture the geometry also with the topology. And as I said, all these structures are based on the gradient of the function rather than the level size. So we have to also see some of the distances to understand the persistence distortion. So one such distance is the bottleneck or the Wasserstein distance. It's defined between two sets, rather multi-sets. So what happens is that the two sets are combined, and the way it is defined is we find a mapping between these two sets. So it's some kind of a bipartite matching where the edges which are matching them should have minimum length, as minimum length as possible. So out of all those mappings, we choose such a set of edges which have minimum length edges. So if a particular point is not being mapped to any of the points on the other side, so it's mapped to the diagonal, and that is considered to be the minimum length edge. So out of these edges, we can, so there is this parameter called Q. We can raise it to the qth power, add it up, and also take the qth root. Or in the limiting case, we can consider Q to be infinity. So that would become the bottleneck distance. And we pick among all these edges, we pick the edge with the highest edge weight. So Wasserstein distance and bottleneck distance have been used for a long time in comparison of point sets like this, and particularly persistence diagrams. Then we have another distance, which is the Hausdorff distance. There is two flavors of this. One is the continuous one, and the other is discrete one. So in our case, the discrete one is more relevant. So in this case, we again have two set of points highlighted in red and blue. So the way the Hausdorff distance is calculated is by first we consider a point in the red set and find the distances with all the other points in the blue set, and we consider the least among them. Again, we consider the next point, and so on. And again, we consider the least among those distances. And among all those short distances, we pick the largest of those. So that gives the distance from set red to set blue. In the other direction also, we do the same thing, which gives us the set distance between the set blue to red, and we pick the maximum out of them to be the Hausdorff distance. So we deal with extremum graph. It can be thought of as a metric graph. So we see some background in the metric graphs. So the graph with a metric is a one which on the edges we can define a positive weight. And if we want to know what is happening in the interior for any point, we can have a weight which is proportional to the distance of that point to the endpoints. So we can define what is known as a natural metric on this kind of metric graphs, where if we want to compute distance between any 2 points on the graph, we can take it to be the infimum of all lengths of infimum of the lengths of all paths between them. So for example, if we want to compute the distance between the node A and node F, we can go in this direction. We can go from A, B, C, D, F, or we can go from A, B, E, D, F, and we can pick the minimum out of this to be the distance between those two nodes. So that would be the distance there. So with the background on the Hausdorff distance, Wasserstein distance, bottleneck, and also the metric graphs, we come to the persistence distortion distance between extremum graphs. So in this case, there are multiple choice to be made. So one is what type of extremum graph to choose. So the extremum graph will look something like this. It would have the maxima, it would have saddles and connecting arcs between them. So one way is that we can ignore the saddles which are at the boundary. So these will be the typically the single degree saddles. We can ignore those saddles. Another variant is where we can ignore the saddle by considering its contribution in some way and actually bypassing that. So these are the choices of the extremum graph which we can pick. In our case, we actually pick this kind of a graph. Then there is a choice of metric. So the metric can be the Euclidean distance or the distance in the domain, which will be given by these kind of edges, which are slightly different from the Euclidean distance. So these are the geodesic distances. Or we can choose the difference between the function values at the nodes as the metric. So depending on the application where the connectivity is important or the geometry is important, we can choose either of the metric or a combination. Then the choice of distance. So the persistence distortion comes in two flavors. One is continuous and other is discrete. So the continuous distance is having a very large running time of around order of n to the power of 12. So and also in our case, the points on the edges of the extremum graph are not very meaningful in the analysis. So we can consider the discrete distance, which is better in running time, and also it makes sense to the case of extremum graphs. So the choice of base points. So we will see what this means in the next slide. So in a particular graph, we can choose a node as a base point, and based on that, we can compute the distances of all the other nodes, and we can build a persistence diagram using this distance as a scalar field. So here the persistence diagram would have two features given by dd dash and cf. If we consider a different base point, then there will be a different set of features. In this case, an additional feature which comes from BA is present in the persistence diagram. So we can consider all the nodes here as base points, and we get so many number of persistence diagrams for this particular graph. So we get a set of persistence diagrams for one graph. Similarly, we get a set of persistence diagrams for another extremum graph too. So we have two sets of persistence diagrams, and by comparing these two in some way, we get the persistence distortion. So how do we do that comparison? So one is the Hausdorff distance between the sets of persistence diagrams, and the individual pair of persistence diagrams, they are compared using the bottleneck distance. So this is how the persistence distortion distance is defined. We show one application, which is again the periodicity detection in the 2D vortex street data. We construct the extremum graphs of all the 1000 time steps, and we compare the time step 0 with all the other time steps. Again, we are able to find the half period, which is 37, and also the full period, which is 75. We are able to find it after a persistence simplification of a threshold of 1%. In the other cases, some of the half period is gone, especially when we don't do a persistence simplification. And also, there is this case where the persistence diagram has only the features corresponding to the connectivity or the cycles in the graph. So depending on that, we further analyze it and see that in many cases, we are able to find both the periodicities, and in one of the cases, we find one periodicity properly, but the other one, we miss some of the periodicities. Then I'll have one slide on the extremum graph data structure, which is the time varying extremum graph. So the time is, okay, yeah. So in this case, so this is a slightly different work compared to the other ones, but it's somewhat related. So there is some overlap in terms of comparison and a time varying data structure, in the sense that when we move from one time step to the other, we have to find some correspondences for the features in one time step to the other time step. And the correspondences can happen in multiple ways. So a feature can continue like this, or it can split into two or more features, or it can, two or more features can merge into one feature, and so on. So computing such correspondences are also in a way comparing two structures. So here, what we do is we extend the extremum graph for the time varying case, we have a simple criterion to compute these correspondences. So the criterion is dependent on 4 factors. One is the function difference, that is the difference of the function value between the critical points, the location of the critical points spatially, and then the function behavior in the local neighborhood. So we consider the neighborhood of the critical point, all the saddles which are neighbors and the maxima which are the neighbors, and we take their contribution while computing this part, and then we consider the topological persistence of that particular feature. So with this criteria, we compute the correspondences, and we have some applications to feature tracking. So here we have a 3D vortex treat which has 508 time steps, and we compute extremum graphs, and we use the correspondences to track features, which are the vortices here. So we are able to track a set of primary vortices and secondary vortices. So this can be useful in many ways for the fluid dynamics experts to see how the evolution of the vortices are going on and so on. So we have 2 measures. I didn't discuss about one of the measures here, but we have 2 measures to compare extremum graphs. We show some utility in periodicity detection and temporal summarization. In case of the time varying extremum graph, we have a simple correspondence criterion, and we also show its utility in feature tracking. So in future, what we want to do is we want to have a general comparative framework where all these measures are incorporated in one place, so that user has a choice of using any of these measures to compare topological data structures and gain some insights. Then we also want to define more comparative measures for many other different topological structures. Then we want to further analyze some of the theoretical properties like stability, discrimination, and so on for many of the measures here. And of course, more applications which would help to drive the case that these distances are very useful in practice. So these are some of the publications which came out of this work. And I also want to acknowledge, in no particular order, the funding agencies for funding the work, and in some cases, some of the travel. I also want to thank my collaborators who collaborated in many of these papers, which was shown in the previous slide: Talha, Aditya, Lynn, Farhan, Devang, Ingrid Hodge, and Somnath. And in terms of data and experiments, we want to thank Srisha Rao, who is here. He helped us in one of the temporal summarization experiments in terms of how the data needs to be interpreted and so on. And we also want to thank Professor Tino Venkov for providing the 3D vortex treat data with the Okubo-Weiss criterion in the full temporal resolution of 508 time steps. So with this, I come to the end of my presentation. So if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take.
You want to call the questions from online also?
Yeah, if there are, I can.
Yeah, I'll try to see if there are questions from here.
Yeah. Yeah.
So initially, you said that bottleneck is
Yes.
and it is sometimes inefficient.
Okay, bottleneck distance is not inefficient, but some of the theoretical measures which have been defined, they are inefficient. Bottleneck distance is actually efficient and it can be used for computation, but it applies for persistence diagrams, and a lot of information is lost when we compute the persistence diagram. If we have more information, like a merge tree or extremum graph, then it makes sense to have comparison measures which directly compare those structures rather than going to the persistence diagram. Generally, bottleneck distance is for point sets in R2. So the point sets are considered as, so there is another detail which I didn't go into because of time, and also it might not be required in some cases, but just a second, I'll go to that. So generally, bottleneck and Wasserstein distances are computed for distributions and point sets. And in this case, when we come to the positions diagram, these points along with the diagonal is considered. So the diagonal is also important in the positions diagram. And so this is a multi-set rather than just a set. And as I said, if there are points which can't be mapped to any of the points on the other side, then all those points will be mapped to the diagonal here. So intuitively, what it means is that these features are one, they are very close to the diagonal, so they can be mapped to the diagonal. That is one. And these are typically these arise from topological noise, and so it can be kind of safely ignored because they don't contribute much to the actual distance. So because of that, so here the setup is like it's a comparison between two multi-sets, but in general, the comparison can be between distributions or set of points and so on.
Starting, you said that there are two data sets, largely and
Extremum. Yes. Distance of definition of yeah. So as I said, from the merge tree, we can compute the persistence diagram, and from the extremum graph also, for example, we can compute the persistence diagram, and then we can apply this. But as I said, those two structures are more rich in information, and if we have a comparative measure which directly compares them, then that would be useful than the bottleneck or the Wasserstein.
Sorry. Maybe you can ask another question later. There was a raised hand on
Okay.
Teams.
Okay.
Maybe able to hear. So you can ask them. I don't know how long they will speak us. I think Harish had his time.
There is a big comment. I think I can read that.
I don't think so. I think that's just a transcript.
Oh, is it? Okay, I thought that's a comment.
Can you ask Harish to ask you the question?
Yeah.
He can hear you.
Yeah, I'll.
You just speak. I think he can hear you.
Yeah, I want to. I think I should unmute him, right? Or I
should be able to unmute him.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Can I ask
I can hear you.
now?
Yes.
Okay. For me, it's mainly, have you made these comparative measures available, or do you plan to make it available?
Okay. Yeah, that's pending work for a long time. As I said, we have plans to this comparative framework, which is a general framework where all these distances will be incorporated. So currently, we have bottleneck, Wasserstein, the global merge tree distance in that. It's not public yet. It's still in private repository. So after the submission, one of the plans is to kind of clean it up and make it public so that it is useful.
Okay, thanks.
And also maybe add the other distances as and when possible. So any other questions?
Maybe you can prompt them to ask you any other question, and then you can come back to that.
Yeah. So people who have joined online, so if you have any questions, please ask me. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And then you said that one particular decay is corresponding at one.
Yes. Okay, I'll go to that slide maybe. It's easy for you to. Yeah.
Right. So green dotted cell is for J7 and I10.
Yeah, correct.
This presents the comparison measure between substituted at I10 and 1T and substituted at J7 it doesn't, right?
Yes.
And then you said that this entry can be computed depending on these 5 other are
Yes,
computed.
correct.
So how do you compute that computation?
Okay. So as I said, this is a dynamic programming algorithm. So the dynamic programming works as follows. So one is we start from the so a tree is a hierarchical structure, right? So we can start from the leaves and we go on to higher and higher subtrees and do this comparison while we move from one level to the next level. So the comparison. So initially there are these leaf nodes. You consider all the leaf nodes. So I said that there is a bipartite matching which is there. So I hadn't discussed it in the presentation, but I can tell you what it is. So what happens is that initially the leaf nodes will be there. You just compare the leaf nodes with each other. So that is just like it will have a relabel insert or a delete cost there. Then when you move on to the next level, what happens? So not even next level, but so in this level itself, for example, you have 6 leaf nodes here and 4 leaf nodes here. So how do you compare a set of 4 nodes there and 6 nodes here? So what you do is you construct a bipartite graph, and to balance the number of nodes in the either side, you add dummy nodes so that the number of nodes are same, and then you construct a bipartite matching. So the bipartite matching has, so the bipartite graph has, maybe I can write it if you want. No, I have it in some other slide. So I copied the slides here. So I should have copied that also. Right.
Unfortunately, those online can't see, but yeah, you should probably prompt them.
Yeah.
They can't hear us.
Okay. Chalk pieces, but there is no marker here. Yes.
It's there, right on the top of the desk. Yes.
Oh, sorry. So these are the nodes. So we have edges here, and edges have particular weights. So the weight of the edge is given by the already computed edit distance between these nodes. So if these nodes are leaf nodes, then the edge weight will be either the reliable cost or yeah, in this case it's a reliable cost, or it can be insert delete cost depending on which one will be the minimum for those two nodes. Similarly, when these are subtrees, so for a particular subtree, we would have computed the edit distance between those two subtrees when we move in this hierarchy. So the edge length will be the created distance between those two subtrees for a particular pair of subtrees. So for a different pair, that edge length will be again based on the created distance of that pair and so on. So in this way, at every level, we are solving this kind of a bipartite graph matching problem, where the edge lengths are given by the created distances for those subtrees, which we have already computed. So in case of the leaf nodes, we first compute the distance as the minimum of these reliable edit, insert delete costs. For the higher level nodes, we consider the entries like this. So if there is a subtree here, so the entry of the entry of this depends on the subtrees of that. So it's a recursive algorithm, and the way it depends is that so I10. So now I think I can use the pointer here. So I10 is compared with J6 and J5. So that's why we have entries in J6 and J5. And similarly for J7, it is compared with I8 and I7. So that's why there are entries at I8 and I7. So we compare this to all the subtrees of this, and we compare this to all the subtrees of this. So that is one step. And we compare this to the empty tree. That is one step. We compare this also to the empty tree. That is another step. And so this entry corresponds to the forest distance. So the forest distance comes via this bipartite graph matching. So it compares a set of subtrees here, which is rooted at J6, J5, and the set of subtrees here, which is rooted at I8, I7. So two subtrees here, two subtrees there. So we solve this biquadrate matching to get the distance between those two, and that would be the forest distance. So the distance here would be the forest distance. That's again the forest distance also depends on the entries in the forest table. So I have combined those two tables by just having this bar here, and so once this is got, this is then an additional edit cost, which is given by the reliable from J7 to I10, or I mean whichever cost is the lowest one there. So that's how this entry is computed. So it depends on, again, so this table itself has two types of entries. One is for the distance between the trees and the distance between the corresponding forests. So we combine all these things for a particular entry. So we start from here. So the tree which is a null tree, so the distance will be 0. Then a tree with node 1, so it will be a delete operation, delete or insert depending on how you see it. So that will be just the edit cost of that. So we fill these entries first, then we use these entries to fill the next level of entries and so on. We come from, so that's why this is a bottom-up approach. So we fill in all these entries by considering the entries which correspond to the subtrees, and finally we come to the last entry which corresponds to the final distance between the two merge trees.
The equalization of the dummy internal nodes are also to equalize the number of nodes.
No, it's not to equalize the number of nodes. So there the problem is, okay, here we compare J7 and I10, we get some kind of a distance between these two trees. But the problem is J7 and I10 are not merge trees. They are a subtree of merge tree. So for a merge tree, the case is that so we have this persistence pairs. As I said that from a merge tree we can always go to a persistence diagram. So the persistence pairs are given by pairing these nodes, and so this node will be paired with this. So here also there will be like J2 will be paired with J6. J1 will, so since J1 will not find a pair here, so it will go beyond this and it will be paired to J7. Then J4 will have no pair in this whole subtree. It will be finally paired to the other node, which is J. So this pairing happens because so the function difference between the nodes which we are pairing, that should be the least. So in so J2 is slightly lower than J1 here. So J2 will be paired with J6 like this. So because of this pairing criteria, so if we consider a subtree like this, which is rooted at J5, I4 will J4 will not have a pair within the subtree. So it won't be a merge tree because of that. So because of that, we add dummy nodes to make it a merge tree. So everywhere when we want to have an entry here, we want entries to be between pairs of merge trees instead of pairs of subtrees, which can be anything here. So that's why we add the dummy nodes there.
What used to be tables.
Yes.
That's okay. I mean, if there are other questions, you could talk to them, and then you can have like a one-on-one discussion. Any other questions? Yeah, this second one.
Okay. So I don't think there are questions there.
Maybe you have to ask them.
Okay.
They can hear you.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So if there are any more questions, people who are online, please ask me.
Let's thank Raghavendra once again. Thank you. Some of you want to have other questions.